So where is Canada after this last lost anti-development Liberal decade? Only 11 years ago, Canada became internationally recognized as home to the richest and biggest middle class in the world, with more children lifted out of poverty than ever before. And heading into 2015, the budget was under control, with $1 billion surplus, and Canada's economy was the strongest in the G7, the last in and the first out of the great global recession. Today, Canada's economy has fallen behind our allies. Productivity lags. Workers can't make ends meet and wonder whose job will be gone next. Canada's natural wealth sits idle in the ground and offshore. Investment heads south and to other countries. Families and people with no one else to count on but themselves fall further behind. Young people lose hope for their futures, whether they will ever be able to afford a home, build up a nest egg, or actually capture their big dreams. Communities lose opportunities and dwindle. Businesses close due to excessive red tape, taxes, costs, constant uncertainty, and have to reduce their charitable and community contributions. Violence, crime, mental distress, and suicides, especially among rural men, are on a steady rise. Killing energy projects doesn't just cut jobs or cost jobs, it costs communities. It takes away critical revenue to build roads and bridges, critical support for social programs, to build arenas, support healthcare like the long-term partnerships with the Lloydminster and Bonnyville Regional Health Foundations and energy companies, and to build schools and universities. Today, Canada works for the super rich, the well-established, the elites, the well-connected, the big companies of all kinds, and mostly foreign founded and multinationals. But it doesn't work for the Canadian people who do the work, who take big risks and build big projects, for individual entrepreneurs, small business owners, innovators, for the workers and contractors who fuel, feed, and power this country, for our Canadian people. That's the Liberal legacy. And the cost to Canadians is real, and it's staggering. So today we MPs find ourselves in an odd position. This very same government that inflicted the last decade of anti-energy, anti-private sector death by delay and uncertainty on natural resources workers and businesses in every corner of Canada, that harmed all the secondary and tertiary sectors that depend on it everywhere, allies sent away in dire need of Canadian resources and divided our country, pit Canadians, provinces, businesses, and sectors against each other, suddenly claims to want big natural resources and infrastructure projects to get built in Canada. So they brought in C5 with all kinds of big promises, but at its heart, what C5 really is a glaring admission that everything the Liberals have done for the last 10 years has made Canada a place where their red tape and constant changing goalposts get to no, and nothing can get built efficiently or affordably. So the real question is, will the Liberals' Bill C5 really clean up the colossal mess the Liberals themselves have made? No. Where are the projects held back by this lost Liberal decade? Where are the investments that would have created prosperity for every single Canadian? Where are the thousands of well-paid jobs for Canadians everywhere, and especially in rural, remote, northern, Atlantic, and Indigenous communities that need them most? Where are the revenues for all three levels of government to fund public services and programs, build public infrastructure, and support communities? Where has all that gone? And how much are we talking about here anyway? Well, Canada has lost $670 billion in cancelled oil, gas, LNG, and pipeline projects alone since 2015, due completely to these Liberals' anti-energy, anti-development messages, policies, and laws. On Wednesday night in Committee of the Whole, the Minister and I discussed C5 a bit. I suggested an obvious, immediate first step if they really want to get Canadians working and building, to strengthen Canada's economy and sovereignty that wouldn't require weeks and months of delay, meeting after meeting, and press conference promises with very few details. The minister said I brought up hypothetical projects and refused to say whether they met his factors for projects in the national interest, which the Liberals themselves will decide. Now, that was alarming in itself, since the projects I mentioned are real projects with real proponents that offer real jobs, with powerful paychecks for Canadians and long-term tax revenue for all three levels of government, real businesses paying real money and losing real time trying to get to build their big projects. The problem is they're stuck. They're stuck in one form of federal regulation or red tape right now. So the immediate solution is blindingly obvious without all this extra rigmarole, uncertainty, and time delays. What was extra weird about the minister's evasion is that of the 5 vague factors they've outlined for C5 that they will use to decide themselves what's in the national interest are 2 of these factors: that projects must bring economic or other benefits to Canada and must have a high likelihood of successful execution. Well, clearly the top priority action then to fast-track efficiently should be all the projects and proponents stuck in red tape right now by these Liberals' own conditions. Where is the Crawford nickel cobalt mine project near Timmins, Ontario? Proposed in 2020, but stuck in the regulatory mess the Liberals created. Where is the Troilus gold and copper mining project in Quebec? Stuck in the regulator since 2023. Where is the Rook 1 uranium mine and Denison uranium mine projects in northern Saskatchewan? Proposed in 2019, both still stuck. Where is the Bruce C nuclear project planned for Ontario? Stuck in double layers of regulatory review. No wonder Canada ranks dead last in the G7 for development. But these projects are not only lost in red tape, they seem to be also lost completely from consideration by the minister, since he was so adamant on Tuesday night that they didn't exist. 5 projects, 5 chances to grow Canada's economy, 5 chances to lead the world in energy, in innovation, in responsible resource development, and Indigenous opportunities. But of course, it's not only those 5 projects. In fact, there are dozens of major energy, nuclear, critical mineral, and Indigenous-backed resource road proposals that are stuck in limbo right now at the federal level. These projects aren't theoretical. They have names, investors, and local support. They've involved years of engineering, technical, environmental, and consultation work, risk, and investment. The missing piece is a federal government with the will to fast-track the assessments through the regulatory maze they themselves created and approve them efficiently, and back proponents once they approve them, so proponents can actually build on their time and on their dime. Because in C69, as is also the case in C5, Cabinet is the final decision maker with all the power. And currently, both officials and ministers already have significant sweeping powers to start, stop, restart, extend, delay, suspend, change the rules, and start all over again as many times as they want. No wonder things can't get built. So they've also got the power to fast-track them right now. Instead, they ignore all those real and ready projects, proponents, and people, and have brought in a short-term workaround of their own bad policies and laws, which is C5. The Liberals talk about emissions reductions, impose electric vehicle mandates, and want so-called green growth, but stall the very projects needed to make all that happen. You can't build electric vehicles without nickel, lithium, and cobalt currently dominated by China. You can't power a reliable, affordable, modern grid without uranium and natural gas. You can't reduce emissions and build new technology without the innovation, jobs, and revenues that come from responsible Canadian resource development, mostly from traditional oil and gas and pipeline companies. Alberta is an example. By 2023, Alberta oil sands reduced emissions intensity while growing production by 96% and leads the country in alternative energy development too, as in fact we always have. According to the federal government's National Inventory Report in 2025, Alberta had the largest absolute reduction of emissions of any Canadian province between 2022 and 2023. Now that's the truth the Liberals won't tell Canadians, isn't it? Albertans cut emissions not by shutting down, but by showing up and building through free enterprise, innovation, and technology, getting better emissions reduction results, real emissions reduction results, without killing jobs or driving away investment. Yet this Liberal government still treats Alberta and every province that develops resources, those of us in the so-called ROC, the rest of Canada, that politicians in Ottawa usually ignore, as problems, not solutions. They punish the most responsible energy producers in the world and give a free pass to foreign polluters. They celebrate emissions reductions in Canada when they come from lockdowns, lost jobs, and bankrupt businesses. Canadians can't afford essentials because the government drives up costs and imposes unrealistic targets on power and fuel. And it's worse when the facts don't fit their narrative. When it turns out Alberta reduces emissions the most, the Liberals stay silent. When LNG could displace coal for growing energy demand in Asia, India, and Africa from BC, or help secure European energy needs and cut dependence on Russia, the Liberals turn allies away. When Western provinces want to build major projects or Northerners want to mine and drill offshore, the Liberals deny, ban, and delay. When Atlantic Canadians want to drill offshore, ship LNG to Europe, or have a pipeline, bring Western oil to Eastern refineries so future generations of Atlantic Canadians can stay home with jobs and abundant opportunities, the Liberals interfere and then look away. And let me pause here to tell you how important that issue is to me, because the fact is that Atlantic Canadians and Albertans are inextricably linked. We've helped build each other's province to the best interests of all Canadians, and I say that as a first-generation born and raised Albertan, as the daughter of a Nova Scotian and a Newfoundlander. When the Liberals spent years talking about reconciliation, yet delay, risk, or kill pipelines, roads, mining projects, and LNG opportunities that so many Indigenous leaders, elders, youth, entrepreneurs, and workers spent years negotiating with businesses to get jobs, to get their own source revenue, and to do environmental oversight in a good way. The Liberals claim to support First Nations, but deny them the opportunity to own, to build, to partner, and to profit. It's not reconciliation when Ottawa decides who can build and who must wait. It's not partnership when one side always says no. And it's not respect when Indigenous voices are ignored because they want to make their own development decisions and exercise their rights and title. Hear, hear. This bill that we debate today proves what Conservatives have said all along. The Liberals' anti-development agenda kills Canadian jobs, kills Canadian investment, weakens Canada's security, unity, and sovereignty, and has made our country a risky place where nothing can get built and where uncompetitive, pancaked, and incoherent taxes, laws, and policies, uncertainty, and constant changing goalposts deter big projects from our own country. Canadians deserve a plan based on facts and results, not vague statements and delay from the same government that caused the problems they suddenly now claim to want to fix. The consequences of the Liberals' anti-development decade are growing poverty, not prosperity, and fractured national unity. They pit Canadians against each other and attack Albertan businesses in particular with constant misinformation and myths. The reality is, when Alberta builds and grows, so does Canada. When Alberta is strong, so is Canada. And Albertans have been there all along with our friends from Saskatchewan and from Atlantic Canada. We've just been asking the Liberals to help get the country's top export from the industry that is still the biggest investor in Canada's declining economy by far, whether the anti-energy zealots like it or not, to more markets globally so Canada isn't dependent on the United States. But 10 years later, 10 years of this last anti-development Liberal decade, Canada faces economic, security, and sovereignty threats from our closest ally, the world's biggest economy, our biggest customer, and now, because the Liberals held Canada back every step of the way, our biggest competitor. And Canadians can't afford essentials because the government drove up the costs of power and fuel for everyone. Now, make no mistake, it didn't have to be this way. But with all due respect, by which I mean almost none, the time to, quote, build Canada, to make our country self-reliant, secure, united, and strong was the last decade. And the answer has always been to unleash Canada's natural resources and increase production and export customers, as Conservatives, and only Conservatives, have consistently and unequivocally advocated the entire time. This was never actually an even-sided theoretical or philosophical debate. It has always been simply the fiscal and economic reality of our country. Canadians deserve a government that backs them, not a government that blocks them, not a government that pees down our leg and tells us it's raining. C5 is breadcrumbs and baby steps, not a real breakthrough of Liberal-inflicted barriers on Canada. Our country needs real change and long-term concrete certainty for the private sector and for Canadian workers to make us autonomous, resilient, and secure, like the Liberals say they want to do now, even though they've been in charge around here for the last 10 years. So what would that actually look like? Well, it would mean fixing the fundamentals. Repeal the failed no new pipelines, never build anything, Bill C-69, rife with uncertainty, no concrete timelines despite Liberal claims, arbitrary and unrelated conditions, political interference, and jurisdictional overreach that the provinces and territories, businesses, and Indigenous groups all oppose or want to overhaul, and the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional for all the reasons, every single reason, in fact, that Conservatives, and it happened to be me, warned about during the debates. But Liberals ignored this entire Conservative team, all the premiers, all the territorial leaders, the private sector, and the Senate, and rammed it through anyway. They should repeal the shipping ban, Bill C-48, that blocks dedicated export routes for Canada's much-needed energy to countries with actually emerging markets who need Canadian energy and technology in Asia, like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines, and to European allies like Germany, Latvia, Ukraine, Greece, and Poland, and the geopolitical security aspects of this issue obviously cannot be overstated. That ban signals that shipping may be blocked by the government off any coast, just like their offshore unilateral drilling bans and anti-development zones on land and in water. But it stays. And clearly the Liberals are A-OK with Canada's allies and other countries getting energy they'll continue to want long into the future from the U.S. or from foreign regimes like Venezuela, Libya, Iran, and Saudi Arabia over Canada, which with much lower environmental, labor, and safety standards, where the benefits usually only go to a wealthy few. Repeal the Canadian oil and gas cap that will cut Canadian energy production by 5%, will kill over 50,000 jobs and over $20 billion from Canada's GDP. That's self-inflicted sabotage that no other country in the world is doing to itself, and totally nonsensical for what is actually a radical anti-energy government suddenly plagiarizing, like someone's thesis, the former Conservative government's vision for Canada as an energy superpower. While the minister and his Liberal buddies laughed when I asked questions about job losses, Canadians stress, wondering where their next paycheck will come from. In 2021, TD Economics projected Canadian oil and gas jobs, up to 75% of them, could disappear by 2050.
Wow.
The Liberals call it a transition. For Canada, it's devastation. So they should repeal the globalist top-down economic restructuring just transition plan in Bill C-50 that the Liberals already know will threaten the livelihoods of 2.7 million Canadians and cause labor disruptions, that's bureaucraties for job losses, for 642,000 workers in the transportation sector, almost 300,000 agriculture workers, 202,000 energy workers, and get this, 193,000 in Canada's important manufacturing sector, maybe more important than ever before, given this world becoming more dangerous and the global threats that Canada faces because this Liberal government has failed us. But the truth is, the future doesn't look brighter with this same government pretending to be a new one. TD reports the unemployment rate in Canada has risen to its highest rate since 2016, outside of COVID, to 7%, and 100,000 jobs to be lost by the third quarter of this year. The job outlook for students is even worse, with a 20% unemployment rate. That's the highest since the 2008 recession. In fact, Canadian manufacturing has lost 55,000 jobs in only a period of 4 months. This is not getting Canada on track. It's the continued track record of this same Liberal government. And you know what they say about lipstick on a pig. It wasn't always this way. Under the former Conservative government, Canada ranked 4th for ease of doing business of all countries in the world. But by 2020, with these Liberals, Canada had fallen to 24th, behind Georgia and Thailand. Today, Canada ranks near the bottom globally for construction permits, for property registration, securing electricity, and cross-border trade. In fact, Canada is ranked second worst in the OECD for construction permit timelines because of these Liberals. The Liberals blocked projects, hiked taxes, and doubled debt has made Canada 30% less productive than the US today. And since 2015, 5.6 trillion, yeah, that's what I said, trillion, has left Canada for the US. That's not a coincidence. That's a Liberal consequence. The trend of Canadian investment up in the US and US investment down in Canada is a historic anomaly caused squarely and for the first time ever by the Liberals' damaging economic and energy policies. Just last week, Stats Can reported a more than 5% decline in forestry, fishing, mining, quarrying, oil and gas since last spring. Declines in primary and resource-producing sectors impact everything else. Ontarians now face the worst unemployment outside COVID since 2013. In April alone, Ontario lost 33,000 manufacturing jobs, tens of thousands of real people who lost their jobs while the Liberals patronize and laugh at opposition MPs fighting for those workers. It's a travesty that it's taken global instability, external threats, growing conflicts, and a cost of living crisis the Liberals created for them to even appear to take notice. Canadians now know, without a doubt, that energy security means food, job, and national security for Canada. Last year, the energy sector contributed 7.7% of GDP, or $208.8 billion to Canada. 446,600 Canadian workers, including 10,800 Indigenous people, relied on natural resources. My point here is that none of this is accidental or externally inflicted on Canada. It's the direct result of domestic anti-development laws and policies. Canada's top global energy and resource competitors have ramped up their production of all kinds in the same time period with much lower standards than Canada. So we arrive at Bill C-5. The Prime Minister, who advised the last one for half a decade and is well known for his global advocacy to keep resources in the ground, hasn't actually explained whether he's had some kind of major philosophical metamorphosis and transformation and an awakening from all his previous values and views, but nevertheless has met with premiers and businesses and suddenly claims to want to do what conservatives have been urging the gatekeeping, road-blocking, radical liberals to do the entire time, which is to build, build, build.
Hear, hear. Except
there are a lot of questions. So let's start at the beginning. As of right now, the Liberals say 5 factors will be considered to determine whether projects are in the national interest. That is, quote, 2, strengthen Canada's autonomy, resilience, and security, provide economic or other, whatever that means, benefits to Canada, have a high likelihood of successful execution, advance the interests of Indigenous people, and contribute to clean growth and to Canada's objectives with respect to climate change. Now, it's worth a pause here to point out that most Canadians would likely be shocked that these factors aren't already part of regulatory and cabinet decision-making and may rightly wonder what the heck the government has been thinking about for the past decade. But also, it's worth noting that these concepts are broad enough that any interpretation or any argument could be made about each factor either way for any project, which is, of course, automatically and inherently uncertain and wide open to manipulation and ideological or politically connected decision-making. So much for objective, technology and sector agnostic, predictable, clear, certain, and evidence-based decision-making in Canada. And as of right now, there is no public list of projects. Now, the Prime Minister says he's getting lists from provinces, and some premiers have said what their asks are, yet the Minister claims there is no list, and that will happen after Bill C-5 is law. The Minister specifically said on Wednesday, I meant Wednesday earlier, not Tuesday, that, quote, when the projects are designated, they will be made public. Well, do the projects drive the legislation, or does the legislation drive the projects? Do they have a list from premiers, or do they not? Well, nobody knows because of mixed messages and misleading answers. But what's clear is the whole thing is a politically driven and determined process, which is actually already exactly what the Liberals have been doing for the last decade. That's the opposite of clarity and certainty.
Order. I have to interrupt the member as it is 11 o'clock. We will now proceed to statement by his members, and the member will have time after question period to conclude her remarks. Statements by members. Continuing debate, the honourable member for Lakeland, and remind her that she does have unlimited time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Oh, thank you to my colleagues. As I said before, question period, C5 is the opposite of inherent clarity and certainty. Now, the Prime Minister and the Minister both claim the projects that provincial and territorial premiers submit to federal politicians, who will then themselves determine whether they're in the national interest, will be approved within 2 years. Except there's not a single concrete timeline in this bill. This is familiar because it's the same claim they made about Bill C-69, but included so much political interference and so many tools for the Commission or for politicians to start, stop, extend, and restart the reviews ad infinitum that there were no concrete timelines in C-69 either. But in C-5, listen to this, the words 2 years literally do not exist. But since the Liberals claim this bill is a reaction to U.S. energy dominance and economic threats to just now start trying to make Canada stronger, they should also look at the U.S. timelines to make sure Canada can compete and beat them to approvals and to market. Now, I'm sorry to say that 2 years was definitely competitive with the IRA 3 years ago when Conservatives first called for the Liberals to match it, and it still is now overall. But the U.S. now has emergency permitting procedures that approve nuclear, oil and gas, mining, and uranium projects on federal lands between 16 and 28 days. And their overall regulatory process is also set to be expedited. So if the Prime Minister said that this is a crisis, he should match his action to that crisis. So Bill C-5 doesn't actually impose 2-year timelines by law in Canada, but if policy decisions afterwards actually do execute the 2-year timetable the Liberals promise, that may end up still keeping Canada lagging behind anyway. I think it's safe to say these Liberals are always and often too little too late. The process is entirely secretive. That means no clarity, no timeline, no certainty, no trust in the Bill C-5. Indigenous leaders from all different perspectives are raising concerns already. I have to say that it was quite astounding to watch my colleague, one I admire very much, the former Enoch Chief, Treaty 6 Grand Chief, and Conservative MP for Edmonton Northwest, and I, by the way, come from Treaty 6, question the minister about whether he understands and has consulted with Indigenous rights holders. The minister named important advocacy groups for Indigenous people, but quite obviously either didn't know or couldn't affirm that he has consulted with actual rights and title holders, even though one of the factors is to advance the interests of Indigenous peoples, but he hasn't talked to them yet. He is a decision maker by his own law, and courts have been clear about the duty for decision makers to be at the table with Indigenous leaders and to make a dynamic effort to address and mitigate adverse impacts. I'm just not sure that the setup of an Indigenous Advisory Council will stand up to challenge about which all Canadians should be concerned. Meanwhile, Canadians wait. Projects stay stalled in the queue. Billions in investments sit idle. Families lose out on good jobs because of Liberal delays, red tape, and uncertainty. Bill C-5 doesn't fix the real problems. Rather, it gives a way for a select politically hand-picked list to circumvent all the laws and policies the Liberals previously and elsewhere argue are just critical. They're the most crucial for the environment, economies, communities, and Indigenous people. Laws that, by the way, these Liberals howl about anytime Conservatives dare to criticize, question, or try to improve them. That list includes the Fisheries Act, the Indian Act, the International River Improvements Act, the National Capital Act, Canadian Navigable Waters Act, the Migratory Birds Convention Act of 1994, Section 98 of the Canada Transportation Act, the Canada Marine Act, the Division 3 of Part 7 of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act of 1999, the Species at Risk Act, the Canadian Energy Regulator Act, the Migratory Bird Sanctuary Regulations, the Dominion Water Power Regulations, Wildlife Area Regulations, Metal and Diamond Mining Effluent Regulations, and the Migratory Birds Regulations, their own, of 2022. So let's be honest. If the Liberals now want to ignore these laws for their preferred projects, that confirms two things. First, these policies have stopped development for years. And second, even if the Liberals claim they will approve projects in 2 years, that claim only really matters if the projects after approval survive legal challenges, so the proponents can build them on their own timeline and on their own dime. So what happens afterwards is also crucial. What happens when activists challenge their approvals and exemptions in court? And from the list I just read, I dare say that there will be more than a few Canadian advocacy groups of all different kinds concerned about this plan. So what happens when those approvals and exemptions are challenged? What happens when litigation and the weaponization of bylaws and laws from other provinces and other municipalities halts progress again? What will the Liberals do then? Attack their own laws or retreat and refuse to enforce federal jurisdiction like they've done before deliberately to kill pipelines and other projects? So Bill C-5 raises more questions than answers, and Canadians deserve the truth. This bill sets up a process that will help a few and leave most behind. On Wednesday, the Natural Resources Minister said, quote, "I think that what we said is that we do not pick the projects, but they themselves also say projects bubble up from consultations between the federal government, provincial government, Indigenous peoples." And when I asked the same question again about the ministers and cabinet as decision makers, the minister said, quote, "The politicians do not pick the projects. But it's clear both from public communications after meetings with premiers that they are, and Bill C-5 clearly says, quote, if the Governor and Council is of the opinion that a project is in the national interest, the Governor and Council, otherwise known as Cabinet, may, on the recommendation of the Minister, by order, amend Schedule 1 to add the name of the project and a brief description of it, including the location where it is to be carried out. Well, that language confirms that the minister plays a direct role and is the decision maker. The minister can also remove projects from the list. Quote, if the Governor and Council is of the opinion that a project named in Schedule 1 is no longer in the national interest, the Governor and Council, that's Cabinet, may, on the recommendation of the minister, by order, amend that schedule to delete the name and the description of the project. Some certainty. Despite the minister's claims, Bill C-5 shows that political discretion, his discretion, decides which projects stay or go, which project people win and which lose. So already one wonders whether the responsible minister, after my engagement with him on Wednesday night, actually even knows what's being proposed in his own bill. And again, there is a public list of major resource and infrastructure projects ready to go, real projects with real proponents that could be deemed in the national interest and fast-tracked immediately. The 28 mining and energy proposals sitting in front of the regulators that could be fast-tracked right now. It's also curious that one of the acts this government could decide to sidestep through C-5 is the Conflict of Interest and Oversight Act. You know, of course, the Prime Minister refused to disclose his own conflicts or where he paid his taxes, and his businesses preferred to invest in pipelines and energy in the U.S. and overseas, not in Canada. But already, this sure looks like the same scandal-plagued backroom dealing Liberals, doesn't it? It should also concern all Canadians that the plan in C-5 is for most of the specifics to be dealt with through policy and regulations afterwards, not transparently and clearly in the law, more on inherent uncertainty. This bill also mixes public and private infrastructure, while the ministers won't give details about the projects. So Canadians would be wise to consider the lack of distinction and whether the Liberals will continue their state corporate financing schemes that always put taxpayers at risk while insiders benefit. Canadians don't want backroom deals. They want a system that works. They want government to clear the path for Canadian responsible resource development by Canadian workers with Canadian materials. Now, the Liberals also keep talking about the need for consensus on projects, and they mean especially for pipelines. But neither they nor Bill C-5 defines what that involves. Consensus from the anti-pipeline environment and culture ministers, consensus from half the anti-energy Liberals who still are in the Liberal cabinet while they try to sound like Conservatives and are actually diametrically opposed to what they've said and done for a decade. I mean, it's amazing they can stand here and look at us with straight faces and do that. The Liberals claim they want consensus, but Canadians know they don't even have it in their own cabinet, and C-5 sets out cabinet as the decision makers. Consensus from all provinces, even though some have before and already say no again, even though interprovincial pipelines for export are indisputably federal jurisdiction. So what will this Liberal government that previously failed to enforce federal jurisdiction and the rule of law, that let activists and other levels of government weaponize laws and bylaws against proponents who already had approval? That failure is exactly what forced the private sector proponent for TMX to abandon their attempts to build, because the federal government didn't use its tools to give legal, political, and jurisdictional certainty for the private sector proponent to go ahead, even after they approved it, after they risked it, ended up buying it, and then created a costly, delayed, nationalized project, a dangerous signal to all investors that Canada is a place where the private sector can't build and government will always rely on taxpayers. Also, are the Liberals aware that there already is a very strong consensus among everyday Canadians everywhere across this country that Canada needs more pipelines? It's been for a long time that way, but it is growing. It's higher than ever before. The latest data shows 79% of Canadians overall, and guess what? 86% of Quebecers want more pipelines for national energy security and resilience. A supermajority of Canadians are in consensus, so it's time for the Liberals to stop delaying dithering and dodging if they really mean all their suddenly new and plagiarized words about wanting Canada to be an energy superpower. Canadians can even be forgiven for skepticism about the broad categories for national interest projects that the premiers push the Prime Minister and ministers to agree. Western Arctic Energy Corridor. Well, Conservatives have always fought for Northerners to make decisions and to get more revenue from resource development to increase Canada's defence and security capabilities in the North. But these Liberals banned unleashing Arctic energy unilaterally from a different country and indefinitely. They also impose massive anti-development areas that also keep Northerners from benefiting from their own natural wealth, a place where there is a humanitarian housing and food crisis and few opportunities for self-sufficiency that aren't related to responsible resource development, if only the government would let them develop it. An Eastern Energy Partnership? Well, these exact Liberals use political interference, changing goalposts at never before or since conditions to force the proponent that had spent years and $1 billion to abandon the nation-building pipeline that would have linked Canada economically and physically for self-sufficiency, self-reliance, and national unity. They killed that east to west pipeline, even though private investors offered to fund it entirely. The pipeline would have connected Canadian energy from coast to coast for self-sufficiency, and they interfered to kill it because of political pressure, even though it too was a proposal strictly in federal jurisdiction. So why should anyone believe them now? Unless what they actually mean is connecting power among the Atlantic provinces, to which Conservatives say the Natural Resources Committee told the government to build interties in 2017. They didn't, and then they tried to study it all over again just a few months ago before Christmas. You know what my advice is? Why don't they just try to get the real simple things done first? A critical minerals pathway? Well, in 2022, these same Liberals announced a critical mineral strategy. How many new mines were approved from it? 0. For example, Canada still does not export a single teaspoon of lithium. None. While global demand rises and China dominates the global production value and supply chains. In 2024, lithium demand rose 30%, but Canada couldn't provide it because mines in Canada take up to 25 years from concept to shovel ready under these Liberals. Why should Canadians think 2025's critical minerals pathway will be different? Next stage nuclear? Well, premiers from all across the country call nuclear critical to Canada's energy future, and Conservatives agree. But these Liberals still haven't given a straight answer. Do all nuclear projects qualify for investment tax credits to compete with the U.S., or will it only be accessible for few, like SMRs and large-scale plants, also important? And if the Liberals are serious about one project, one review, why don't they fix the fundamental problem instead of the short-term C5 queue-jumping workaround? Nuclear, for which Canada has long been world-renowned and viewed as an expert by other countries, proposals already face 2 reviews, an impact assessment and a full review by the expert Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. Why? Why can't there be a one project, one review process like Conservatives have always promoted and get things built? And why couldn't the minister say definitively that existing nuclear proposals stalled in review right now are in the national interest? Canada can't attract investment when the rules are vague, shift, and politicized. Businesses and workers need clarity, not confusion and more questions. Infrastructure for trade diversification. Well, this kind of government can't even get roads built, and the culture minister said he doesn't think Canada needs any more anyway. The Webequie Supply Road Project, the Martin Falls Community Access Road, and the Northern Road Link Project, all backed and co-owned by Indigenous communities that would unlock the Ring of Fire, remain locked in the regulator right now. So forgive us for suggesting that government cannot unleash critical minerals if it can't even get the roads built to develop and transport them, and those roads are the place to start. It's time to stop talking and start approving. Canadians deserve leadership that actually sets attractive, competitive investment conditions so the private sector can build. The track record of these Liberals is the opposite. Projects that promise not only billions for our economy, but jobs for our communities, paychecks for Canadians, and revenue for governments for infrastructure programs. Let's talk about some of those numbers. Here are some of the projects that have been killed by these Liberals. The Grassy Point LNG project, loss of $10 billion. The West Coast Canada LNG project, loss of $25 billion. The Aurora LNG project, loss of $28 billion. Prince Rupert LNG project, the loss of $11 billion. The Pacific Northwest LNG project, loss of $11 billion. The Quispa LNG project, loss of $18 billion. The Energy Saguenay LNG project lost $4 billion. The Frontier Oil Sands Mine project, a loss of $20.6 billion. The Aspen Oil Sands project lost $2.6 billion. The Dunkirk Oil Sands SAGD project, a loss of $2.4 billion. The Muskwa SAGD Oil Sands project, a loss of $800 million. The Carmen Creek Oil Sands project, loss of $3 billion. The Frederick Brook Shale project, loss of $700 million. The Mackenzie Valley Gas Pipeline, a loss of $16 billion. The Energy East Pipeline, a loss of $15.7 billion. The Northern Gateway Pipeline, a loss of $7.9 billion. This is just a few examples of the lost $670 billion in canceled or suspended projects on these same Liberals' watch. How can the Liberals really pretend to play Team Canada when they've done everything possible to hold Canada back, especially when half the cabinet ministers are exactly the same as the old ones? Now, these Liberals have claimed falsely there was no business case for these projects, except there obviously were to the private sector proponents ready to make major long-term investment, and to all the countries who want more Canada. The Liberals have let Canada's competitors win, and they've made Canadians lose. It's not only allies that have surpassed Canada and profited from it because of the Liberals, it's also our adversaries and hostile imperialist regimes who have outgamed and outpaced the West, while politicians here dithered, virtue signaled, and imposed policies and laws that kill Canadian jobs, Canadian businesses, Canadian supply chains, and have made Canada more expensive, more vulnerable, and weak. In March 2022, Latvia, quote, wholeheartedly supports Canadian LNG to cut reliance on Russia. June 2022, Ukraine seeks Canadian LNG. Years into Russia's invasion, Canada still has no East Coast LNG exports because their opponents abandoned the three proposals, actually, just in the last couple of years, Atlantic Canada, because probably in part because the Liberals kept saying there's no business case. Some confidence the Liberals had in Canada, and 10 years of elbows down and resources in the ground made Canada a target, and Conservatives warned them all along. August 2022, Germany begged for Canadian LNG, but the Liberals rejected that ally. Then they made a deal with Qatar, which hides Hamas and gets to rake in billions of dollars and drive in the desert with fancy sport cars and Rolex watches, while Canadians' food prices become the highest in the G7, unemployment rates skyrocket, and the Liberals plan to ban internal combustion engines. In December 2022, Poland looks to Canada for LNG to diversify energy sources, obviously for their national security, but gets nothing. In January 2023, Japan formally requests Canadian LNG. The Liberals refuse. In February 2023, Japan's ambassador, 1 month later, Japan's ambassador says, quote, the world is waiting for Canada. The Liberals keep them waiting. May 2023, South Korea wants Canadian LNG. The Liberals do nothing. In March 2024, Greece's Prime Minister says they absolutely want Canada's LNG, but Liberals refuse to grant export licenses. In April 2024, Poland's president said they would, of course, buy Canadian LNG if Liberals made it available. In May 2024, the Philippines expresses interest in Canadian LNG trade and investment. Nothing from the Liberals. In November 2024, Taiwan wants to buy and invest in Canadian LNG for obvious security reasons and self-reliance in their region that all Canadians should care about. The Liberals block them. In February 2025, Canada refused Japan's, also another obvious security implication, Japan's LNG request. after they had refused Japan's LNG request in 2023. This is what happened in February 2025. The U.S. delivered a multi-trillion-dollar LNG deal to Japan instead. And Mexico has now flown past Canada for LNG exports, while the U.S. is the top in the world. The Liberals started with 15 LNG proposals in 2015. Only 3 were approved, and only 1 is operational now. And by the way, those ones that were the one that's operational now was approved by the former Conservative government and then delayed, put through another review, and made at risk by these Liberals. So we all are lucky that that proponent hung in, and they should not delay on approving its second phase. But during that time, during the loss of 15 LNG proposals in Canada, the U.S. approved 28. 12 approved, 8 under construction, and 8 operational right now. So the U.S. is now the top exporter in the world of LNG. Canada should have been ahead of them and a key partner for North American energy and national security. But the Liberals held Canada back with a distinctly elbows down approach. Except to Canadians, right? It sure gave us 1 or 2 or 10. The Prime Minister says it's elbows up against the United States, but year after year after year, these same Liberals handed the Americans trillions of dollars from Canada on a silver platter. The U.S. must remain Canada's top ally with safe borders and integrated security. And they are our top ally, but there's no doubt that because of these Liberals, the U.S. is also our top competitor, a result of damaging Canadian domestic policy. Now, Conservatives have always been the consistent advocates for certainty, clarity, competitive, and fast approvals to make Canada strong, self-reliant, and united. So, of course, we hope this government yeah, I am still going, because of course we hope this from this Liberal. So of course we Conservatives hope this government actually can show Canadians that big, audacious, nation-building projects can get approved and built in competitive timelines by the private sector, not by taxpayers. We take seriously our constitutional bound duty and role to oppose. But we also take seriously our job to propose solutions in the best interests of all Canadians. So I will now. The Liberals will need to fix Bill C-5 and make it transparent, clear, and certain. Here's what their amendments must address and clarify: the definition of national interest, transparency of the project list, fulfillment of the duty to consult, not an advisory board, concrete 2-year timelines, and a timeline on the final decision by Cabinet after a recommendation, transparency about the project lists, application of the Conflict of Interest Act and screens for politically connected insider proponents, clarity about the mandate for regulatory reviews to monitor and ensure actual deliverables are achieved on time and on budget, hopefully not on taxpayers' backs. But the real fundamental permanent solution for confidence and certainty in Canada is to repeal or amend significantly all the acts and policies the Liberals admit by C-5 are barriers to build, not a short-term ad hoc case-by-case basis, almost of which all the details will be determined after the bill is law through policy and regulations. That means politicians and bureaucrats will do all this secretly and differently with each project. I mean, I guess that approach fits, since neither the Prime Minister nor the Minister seem to be fond of answering Canadians' questions, or maybe just from women, and both constantly repeat that they won't negotiate in public about their interactions with the U.S., by the way, which Canadians deserve to know about. Their MO already seems to be just like the old guys. It's backroom deals, and that's what C-5 is. Cut Canada's industrial carbon tax that punishes hard work that none of our main competitors have. That tax smothers Canadian steel, aluminum, natural gas, food production, and cement. It chokes competitiveness, forces companies to lay off workers, move operations abroad, and leave towns behind. That's not think globally, act locally environmental stewardship. It's economic self-sabotage. A Canadian government should put Canadian workers, Canadian industries, and Canadian producers first. Yeah. Well, we'll get into it, I guess. Set a clear 6-month target with a 1-year maximum to approve major projects, just like Conservatives proposed. Investors cannot wait 10 years for answers or keep giving the same information repeatedly to regulators to be denied or sent back to the beginning at any time. Delay means defeat. Projects need certainty. Workers need timelines. Resources need action. The government must stop talking and start approving. Canada needs a Canada First multi-use national energy corridor and shovel-ready economic zones to unlock our potential. East to west, north to south, pipelines, power lines, highways and rail, built to connect, not divide, built to move resources from the source to the world, built for Canadian prosperity, sovereignty, and unity. Conservatives believe in common sense solutions. And Canadians, without a doubt, Canadians deserve better. They deserve strong paychecks, real jobs, energy independence, self-sufficiency and security, and national unity. Only Conservatives have fought to achieve Canadians' ambitions and to restore Canada's promise through responsible resource development every single day in every single way. Only Conservatives will stand with the workers who power this country, the families who depend on them, and the businesses that need them. Conservatives will fight for a real plan that unleashes Canadian potential, restores Canada's promise, strengthens our economy, and builds a proud, united, powerful, and self-reliant Canada. Thank you.
Bravo.